Welcome to yet another in the series of Perth U.S. Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with former U.S. Ambassador to South Korea, Mark Lippert. Mark really needs no introduction to the Perth U.S. Asia Center community. This past August, he was one of the keynote speakers at our second annual WA Indo-Pacific Defense Conferences, and we were delighted to have been able to entice him down to the fair shores of Western Australia. I've also considered Mark a good friend and a partner in crime in many respects over the last 15 years or so of my career. Mark served in the United States Senate. He was a foreign policy advisor to a young senator from Illinois named Barack Obama. Also had a distinguished career in the Navy Reserves, served as an intelligence officer, not only serving in Iraq during the conflict itself, but in subsequent years. And after the election in 2008, served as chief of staff for the National Security Council in the White House before again returning for a couple of years to military service. When he returned to public service after that, he was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Asia and Pacific Security Affairs in the Pentagon, the most senior security official in policy matters inside the U.S. Defense Department, after which he was asked to serve as the Chief of Staff to then Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. And at the end of that, he served as the United States Ambassador to South Korea from 2014 to 2017. Those of you who know me know that I've spent the better part of 30 years working on Korea, and I have to confess that in that time, I cannot think of a more effective ambassador, not just from the United States, but period, in serving in South Korea. And Mark has had a tremendous impact, not just on the U.S.-Korea relationship, but more broadly on Korea's position in the world. And since then, he's had experience in the private sector as Vice President International for Boeing, and now serves not only on the board of the Asia Foundation, but also as a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And as such, continues to have a major voice in the policy debate surrounding not just the Korean Peninsula, but broader security, diplomatic issues in the Indo-Pacific region. So Mark, thank you. Thanks for making time. Although we're, I think, 13 hours different from time, it's very kind of you to agree to this virtual chat here today. I greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure, and thanks, Gordon. Thanks for the introduction. It's a real treat to be here. I'm glad we're recording this. I'm going to send this to my mother, who says when she hears my resume about all that bouncing around, I can't keep a job. So we really appreciate it. And the feeling's mutual, Gordon. We in the United States are so appreciative of the great work you're doing to strengthen another important alliance between the United States and obviously Australia. So thank you and thank you to you and the team for all the great work you've done down there, are doing. And I got to see it firsthand a little bit, as you mentioned, with the conference last year. It's quite an important piece of business you're doing down there at the center of the Indo-Pacific rebalance.
Well, we like that. We like that phrasing. Now, I probably should have been a little bit more clear. I understand that you're continuing your ambassadorial role, but not representing a country, but a sport. And that I saw a recent wonderful profile in the Washington Post about the role that you're playing in popularizing Korean baseball in the United States. And in fact, this probably will get more interest among our Aussie listeners than anything else. Australia is a sports mad nation, and we've been deeply deprived for the last 2 months. And as it happens right now, if I understand correctly, the only live professional sports being broadcast in the United States is coming out of South Korea. So could you take us back maybe to your time as ambassador in South Korea? Tell us, what is the deal with Korean baseball?
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Gordon. And you're right. I am continuing this hard-earned title of the honorary ambassador of the Korean baseball organization, which is called KBO for short. It requires eating a lot of fried chicken and Korean food and watching a lot of baseball. So it's really tough duty, as you might imagine. But on a serious note, the way this got started for me is that we saw that there's a common bond between the United States and Korea, and both are, like Australia, sports mad nations, and both are baseball mad nations. And baseball came to Korea about 100 years ago through missionaries. There's been a professional league on and off in Korea for decades, really dating back all the way back to Japanese occupation of the Korean Peninsula. And in 1982, the KBO was formed into this professional league, which I called a gem in the Washington Post. It started with 6 teams. It's now grown to 10 teams. 5 of the teams are in and around Seoul. There are 3 Seoul teams and 2 in the suburbs. 2 down in the Busan area, Daegu, Gwangju, and Daejeon all have teams. So it is something that is unique. It's a remarkable departure from Major League Baseball in that the rules are very much the same. They're played in the American League style with a designated hitter. In the U.S., there are 2 basic styles. The pitcher bats or the pitcher does not bat. The pitcher does not bat in KBO, but there's a key difference. There are cheerleaders, a raucous fan base, Korean food, and what people call our cheer songs. And every player has a cheer song. They walk up to the plate. The song is played throughout the duration of the at-bat. And I think the most interesting thing is every Korean fan knows the cheer songs by heart. There are YouTube videos on how to sing the cheer song and how to dance to the cheer song. So among other things, and I'll end on a serious note on this question, we felt that not only was it a lot of fun, not only was it a great American export, if you will, it was something that brought our 2 peoples together. You would go to a baseball game, there would be anywhere from 10 to 20,000 people there. You could mingle. Koreans were having a good time. It was a great opportunity for me as ambassador to engage in some people-to-people diplomacy. And what I would say is that ambassadors, as I am living proof, administrations come and go, but the people-to-people ties are what really are the bonds of the relationship, and give diplomats, when they're practicing policy development, flexibility. You keep the 2 countries out of hard choices. If there's a popular base of support, there's more tolerance for risk-taking, there's more tolerance for creative solutions, there's more tolerance for clever policymaking that strengthens the relationship and strengthens the alliance. So it is a great thing. I continue to hold the title dearly. My wife, whenever she wants to throw away all of my Korean baseball swag, or at least thin it down, I point to all these honorary titles that I have in Washington Post articles as a thin defense to keep my KBO sport gear around.
Well, I'll have to try to follow your example and push KBO here in Australia. I think we might have a little bit more competition from cricket. But I would note that just in the last 4 months, there is a new Korean chicken franchise opened up here in Western Australia, and it's called Supreme Leader Chicken, and it's that wonderful Korean style fried chicken. So we've got the chicken, we're working on the baseball going forward. If I could turn to Korea itself, again, it's probably been just as long for you as me in that country. I don't know when your last visit there was, but I was late last year. And Korea is a remarkable story in the global story surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. I noted that the United States and South Korea had their first reported case of the virus on the exact same day, the 19th of January, or the 20th rather of January of this year. By mid-March, both South Korea and the U.S. each had about 90 reported fatalities because of the virus, and yet the response and the results of those 2 countries since couldn't be more divergent. I think as I checked it this morning, South Korea has now had 263 deaths as a result of the virus, and the United States just pushed over 92,000. And so really divergent. And I think in most countries right now are looking at South Korea as a prime example of how best to respond to it. So how do you understand the relative success of South Korea in its response to this global pandemic?
Well, I think your 2 questions, your first 2 questions actually go hand in glove. No pun intended with the baseball analogy. The reason the Koreans are playing baseball is because of their successful response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are a number of factors at work. And I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be a scientist. So I always am ready to be corrected by those in the scientific community who are following this pandemic each and every day. And as you know, Gordon, we're learning new things about this every day. So the success insofar to this point might only be temporary. And the Koreans know this, and their President Moon Jae-in went out the other day and actually said, hey, we're not out of the woods yet. So I think I start with that baseline. But what did they do in terms of lessons learned? Go back 3 or 4 years. The Koreans had an outbreak of the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS. And to my knowledge, it's the only episode of this, of a serious outbreak outside of the Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. And what happened there in 2015, 2016 timeframe is that the Koreans almost lost control of that situation. It was a very, very scary situation, as I will personally attest. The United States and Korea worked closely together. We brought in the CDC. We brought in some other health experts. The Brits actually brought in a health expert. And the Koreans were eventually able to get this back in the box and contained and resolve this issue. But the important note here is that they learned this lesson dramatically. They inculcated the lessons deeply, and they were ready for this round. They had already been dealing with SARS for a while. Then they had this MERS episode. So when they saw this coming, COVID-19, and they saw what was going on in China, they reacted, and they reacted decisively and swiftly. And I put a real premium on the decision-making and the speed, because we now know that weeks, days really matter. And the Koreans, right at the get-go, reacted. I think that's the most important point. The second thing they did, obviously, is they started manufacturing tests almost immediately. And now they have a large number of tests, and together with their ability to contain the virus in terms of social distancing and some light measures, they never did go to full lockdown, but they did effectuate a number of policy changes that mitigated and reduced the numbers. They're now able to engage in contact tracing and quarantine effectively. So they're able to essentially chase this virus around. I think that's the second point. All the manufacturing capabilities of tests, PPE, coupled with the readiness. A couple of other factors that I think were important. I do think the Koreans having a very centralized government, a people that is relatively marshaled. The Koreans live under constant threat of war from North Korea, and every military age male serves in the Korean military. So I think having a sense of readiness baked into the Korean system, it's something that's underreported, but I think is important. So when the government did swing into action, there was the ability of the Korean population to more or less follow the government's lead, support the government's lead, and work together. And the last thing I'll say is that they were able to go into Daegu, where the outbreak really started in Korea, is a town called Daegu. It's a big regional city. It's actually where the Samsung Lions play their home baseball games. But there was a church group that had come back from China. And there's a whole case study around what they did in Daegu to isolate that church group early that dovetails with the other more macro features that allowed this response to basically be a model for the rest of the world. Final point, I would say, the Koreans now, though, there have been mistakes along the way. And I think you look in early days, there was criticism of the administration in Korea for allowing too much travel into Korea too early. That was one thing. And the Korean government, I think, did recover from that. The other thing that is ongoing now is that last week or so, there was a decision to open up nightclubs in Seoul. And some of these nightclub activities led to a serious outbreak. And cases are now in double digits, mid-30s was the last report, up from single digits. And people are really on the knife's edge watching to see if these cases that developed from a result of the nightclubs reopening will develop into something larger and more threatening. But all in all, a very, very strong success story out of the box. A lot of factors going into it. I just touched on the surface, but I do think they are a model and a lesson for the rest of the world, particularly on preparedness and particularly on swift decision-making in the early days.
There was a fascinating episode in the state of Maryland where Governor Larry Hogan, apparently his wife is ethnic Korean, and unable to get testing kits in the United States, managed to somehow get them shipped in out from South Korea. So remarkable evidence of those kind of personal bonds that you were talking about earlier on. Can I ask a related question? And that is about the state of Korean democracy. Just in the last several decades, we've had two Korean presidents been impeached, one restored to office, one removed from office completely. Korean democracy is not for the faint of heart. It's been quite raucous lately. You mentioned that some early missteps early on for the current president, Moon Jae-in. And yet, after getting more of a firm footing in the response, he's quite popular and received what seems to be a pretty strong mandate coming out of midterm elections that took place in the midst of a pandemic. Because the United States is in the middle of an election year right now, I'm wondering if you have any observations about the status of Korean democracy and obviously the processes of democracies and how they might take place during health crisis like the current COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, great questions, Gordon, and you know Korea well, and it shows in the questioning. I guess what I would say is, first, just on some of the early missteps for which the administration was criticized, I think they rebounded quickly. I think that was a key factor, and those missteps or mistakes that they were criticized for happened right on the outset of election season in Korea. So I think that was an interesting thing that the Korean electorate paid such sharp attention and was watching this issue so closely. And I do think that this was a very, very important variable in determining who won and who lost in the outcome. Obviously, as you alluded to, the ruling party, Moon Jae-in's left of center party, the parties change names quite frequently in Korea, as you know, but there's essentially a left of center coalition and a right of center coalition. The left of center coalition won in dramatic fashion. And I think it does strengthen Moon Jae-in's mandate going forward. What I think will be interesting is he's dealing with a very different world than he was just a few short months ago. He's really in pandemic response, and that's really sucking up the bandwidth in Korea. And if you look at the headlines in Korea these days, it's all about a return to school. It's all about the economic package to bail out or recover from this. And it's really about this response. So I think that's what's kind of interesting here about this election. It would have been interesting to see how the chips would have fallen had there not been a pandemic, but the pandemic was dispositive in the election, and it will be a critical issue going forward, I think, for several months in Korea, gobbling up a lot of the bandwidth for other policy initiatives or other activities that the ruling party might otherwise want to do. Couple of points on Korean democracy. I continue to be a big believer and supporter in the robust nature of Korean democracy. I think what people quickly forget who don't study Korea as deeply as you do, Gordon, is that it's a young democracy. They've been only at this for a few decades. And the ability to essentially have a series of peaceful elections, albeit some with hiccups, and a relatively peaceful impeachment of a sitting president. I would say a peaceful impeachment of a sitting president of Park Geun-hye just a few short years ago is quite remarkable for a democracy this young. Obviously, it's an evolving process. The Koreans have changed their election laws several times. They did another change this year or last year, dealing with kind of the mix of proportional and first past the post election. They lowered the election age from 19 to 8, or the voting age, from 19 to 18. So they are still, I think, adjusting Korean democracy as it goes. But I think big picture, if you back up, I think you have to say the state of Korean democracy is robust. I think the state of Korean elections is a good one. And I think having this election in the middle of a pandemic and having pretty remarkable results and a peaceful outcome is another, I would say, benchmark in terms of just the institutional strength of democracy in Korea.
You have to admit that there are some relative advantages to having a relatively young democracy, and that is precisely that you can tinker around the edges and you can adjust the format. You were talking about first past the post elections. We have a very different system here in Australia than I was familiar with in the United States, and yet the prospects for structural change in the mechanism of democracy in the United States seems to be a much heavier lift than it would have been in Korea. I might also add there that, when I first went to Korea, and I can't claim the history of these long-term Korea watches that were there in the 1960s, but I was first in Korea in the mid-1980s, and it was still under military rule. There was a military dictator in a former Colonel Chun Do-hwan who was ruling the country. Most international magazines were still highly censored. You could pick up Time magazine, but it had black marks around any reference that was unfavorable to the government in Korea. Military heavily on the street, and the prospects for democracy, at least prior to the Olympics in 1988, seemed quite scant. So you're exactly right. I still like to think of my career trajectory and the arc of my life as relatively short, and there's been such tremendous change in that country in that period of time.
Well, and you're right, Gordon. And I don't want to keep you from going on to the next subject. But what I would say is, just to put a kind of bow around it, is I think there's a fair argument to say that the Koreans have undertaken the sharpest democracy and development rise in the history of the world, you could argue, or at least in modern times. And people forget that, right? And so you go back just a few short years, and you go back into the 1980s, which I like to think, like you, we're not that old, and it was a very, very different Korea. And the change is remarkable, number one. Number two, the ability and the continued, I would say, self-awareness to I would say, modify some of the structures. But there are challenges, right? And there are issues that are ongoing debates within Korea about the size and the nature of their democracy, right? How much power does the presidency have? There's been constant calls to try to reduce the power vested in the presidency and spread more to the National Assembly. The courts, we've had a big advantage of our two systems, the US and Australia, is decades, hundreds of years of jurisprudence, right, that kind of backs up this democracy. The Koreans, that piece is coming, and that's still nascent. So it's a really, I think, something that it's a really interesting subject for outsiders to look at. It's a really great example of Koreans and all of their success. And it's something that I think will be really pivotal to how the success of Korea is going forward for decades to come.
So one part of that story that can't be separated out, at least in the post World War II timeframe, is the alliance relationship between the United States and South Korea. You and your time, obviously, in the military itself, but in the Senate, in diplomacy as an ambassador, and your long years working in the Pentagon, were directly involved in alliance management between the U.S. and South Korea. But as someone who spent 25 years in Washington, where my view of alliances was Korea versus Japan, have had quite a sharp learning curve coming to Australia, which is a very different relationship altogether. And yet, no matter whether you're looking at more faltering alliances, such as, say, the Philippines or Thailand, or firm alliances like Australia or Korea or Japan, it's hard to make the case that the U.S. system of hub and spoke alliances, at least in this region, are vibrant. It's been a rough couple of years under the current administration, and one of the issues that's really caught my attention has been an extremely acrimonious and, more importantly, public debate over cost sharing, burden sharing. The costs that Korea pays the United States to support the presence of U.S. troops in the Korean Peninsula. And it's been handled in such a way that it has been more public than in any time in the 30-odd years I've been working on Korea. You've been, directly involved in these issues in the past. Can you give us a better sense for not just the state of the democracy in Korea, but the state of Korea's alliance relationship with the United States?
Absolutely. Well, Gordon, thanks. Great question. And maybe just to level set, because it can be a confusing set of acronyms for those who don't follow this every day. In fact, when I showed up as ambassador, having worked in the Pentagon, I was still learning the acronyms and command structures. And just a couple of things. I think, first of all, the United States has about 28,500 troops on the peninsula. There are three principal command structures at present. There's United States Forces Korea, which is commanded by a four-star U.S. military general. There's the Combined Forces Korea, which is a combined command between the Koreans and the United States. And in certain times of defense condition, when tensions are running high, that the Combined Forces Command becomes operational. The 4-star U.S. general takes command of all troops on the peninsula. There is a misconception out there. Day to day, the Koreans themselves have responsibility for the defense of the peninsula. It's only in certain defense conditions, which are, really serious escalations, that the United States and the Combined Forces Command would take over. And finally, there's the UN Command. The UN Command controls the demilitarized zone and some maritime boundaries along the Han River estuary. And that is commanded by a U.S. 4-star general, the same U.S. 4-star general, but has a reporting element that goes back to Washington and up to the United Nations. And it's a vestige of the Korean War. So you have these 3 command structures. And I think those are really important in understanding how the alliance works. I think that the point in terms of the alliance management, first, I would say, broadly speaking, what's interesting is that the United States military presence in Korea remains popular. And you and I can both remember a day when that wasn't the case. It polls extremely highly now, depending on which poll, anywhere from 60 to 80%. And that's quite remarkable. And we've come a long way. And I always point to that element as evidence that the partnership, the relationship has really matured. And there's less of a debate about whether, at least among Koreans, whether there's going to be U.S. troop presence on the peninsula, but how, and where, and under what conditions. There's a couple of other things that are out in the ether that I think are important. There's a concept called operational control. I referenced that earlier. That's when the Combined Forces Command becomes active and the U.S. general takes command of all of the troops on the peninsula. There's a debate now about whether that individual should be a Korean general. And there are conditions under which OPCON would change in its form and lead to a Korean taking over. And Moon Jae-in the president has made this a priority for his administration. To your point about this burden sharing issue, the Korean and the United States sit down about every 5 years and work out who pays what. And generally, the Koreans pay somewhere between 50 and 55% of all non-personnel costs. And the Koreans, I would also add, are not free riders by any stretch of the imagination. First, the alliance is real. It is operational. The Koreans put real resources. Every single military-aged male in Korea is subjected to conscription. There is a real element to that. And these are individuals that would otherwise be in sort of the prime earning phases of their life or educational phases. So it's a real cost that the Koreans are willing to undertake to subject all of these individuals to possible conscription. The Koreans pay, their defense increases are between 5 and 8% every year. It's remarkable. They buy a lot of US kit. Between 92 and 96% of all the equipment they buy is the United States, as I recall. And they built the United States the largest overseas military installation in the world at a cost of $10 billion and paid upwards of 96% of that. So the Koreans come into this as being what I would call a very robust partner. And having been at the Pentagon in a global position, we have this ongoing discussion with the Europeans about paying certain levels in NATO and all that. The Koreans, I've always viewed as really are more active in that regard, and there are more resources poured into and in a range of fronts on the peninsula. So this burden sharing issue, the last time we negotiated it was 2012, and you're saying, well, wait, it's not in 2012, and it kind of ended up finishing up in about 2014, and you start to say, wait a second, it's 5 years, it's more than 5 years. And the answer there is the Koreans have offered to go up. They've gone up before between 5. They've sort of now put offers, if you believe the press, between 8 and even upwards of that. And the Trump administration has categorically rejected those. They've structured a series of one-year deals, or at least a one-year deal. And there are ongoing rolling negotiations about how much the Koreans should pay. And those have become, as you rightly pointed out, somewhat acrimonious in the Korean press. There's been some press about the State Department at high levels wanting to get agreement and the White House disagreeing. The kind of the internal Washington elements have come into play there, and where the president is very important. He's made this a priority under his watch. So I guess you would say that the current agreement has run its course. We're on a series of temporary extensions. We've been actually paying unions that work on U.S. military installations less, so there are real implications on the ground. And, this has caused political friction in Korea. The final point, though, I would say, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful that we can get to a reasonable place on this. I do think that at least friends, colleagues in the Pentagon and the State Department, they're trying to find creative solutions, but it gets hard because at some level, it's a zero-sum game. It's a number. The number's politically charged in both capitals, and finding a creative way out of that is going to be really important to getting the alliance back on what I would just say a more even keel. So we talk less about resources and burden sharing and more about all the important global things we're doing together, like fighting pandemics or dealing with the North Korea threat.
Well, you're clearly demonstrating, your considerable diplomatic skills, and that really informative response. I have to say, I, being far less diplomatic than you, have been struck by several things. One, the president of the United States, in the middle of kind of his weekly COVID-19 pandemic briefing, is kind of going out of its way to make the point that he has rejected South Korean offers and to kind of slam them on that. Having a sitting Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense pen an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, essentially calling a U.S. ally, a deadbeat country in terms of the bills and what they pay. And then more importantly, this kind of deadbeat in public demands for a quintupling of Korea's contributions, which the reasons that these are so difficult are because Korea is a democracy. And when things like this kind of play out in public, it's harder and harder for a democratic ally like South Korea to respond, precisely because of the very overt kind of browbeating that they're receiving. So I'm delighted to hear your optimism. I hope it's correct, but it really has been a situation that's troubled me greatly during the course of this year. So.
Yeah, and Gordon, I would say one of the reasons I'm optimistic is that I do feel that there was a point about, you would say, sort of, I'm losing track of time, right? I would say somewhere between about 6 months ago, where I felt that things were really extremely hot and really on the verge of something. So something could have gone wrong in that time frame. I think we're at a cooler place now. There are more conversations, but I do think some of the structural issues that you identified are still extant, and those could flare back up again. So I'm a little more optimistic in this phase. The other quick thing that I would say is that I think you're exactly right in terms of something I didn't mention, is that the National Assembly does play an important role. And as we just mentioned at the outset, there is an election. Moon Jae-in's hand in the assembly is stronger. And I think that is an important element that's injected into this. Final point, the other reason I am a little more optimistic is, in addition to some of the issues having cooled down, there is just less talk in Korea about whether the United States should be in Korea, those kind of existential questions about the alliance. I think we could have veered into a conversation about that very easily a few months ago, and we seem to have stayed out of that for now. And I think that is a cautiously optimistic note that I just wanted to sound on the big picture. But we've got to get to an end game where we put this behind us. It's gone on too long. We need to resolve it. We need to wrap it up, both in terms of the friction it causes in the relationship, but also the opportunity cost. And I think the opportunity cost is huge in terms of partnering with a global, an alliance that is now global, that is working across a whole host of issues, not least of which is public health, in a constructive and consultative manner. And I think a lot of analysts put put their focus on kind of the here and now friction. I would just add to that the opportunity costs that are extant in this as well.
Well, thank you. That's extremely helpful. I mean, Australia, like Korea, is a treaty ally of the United States, but the nature of the alliance and the issues are very, very different. So it's helpful for our listeners to understand that nuance that you've explained so clearly. We have done something which is extremely rare in a conversation about Korea, which is, we've gone for almost 40 minutes, and we've not yet mentioned North Korea, and we certainly haven't mentioned his dear leadership, if that's a term these days, Kim Jong-Un, unless you refer to my supreme leader chicken kind of analogy, which I think is a play on North Korea. But that is an issue which obviously was extremely important during your tenure as ambassador. It was very hot at the very end of your time as ambassador. We were in a time when President Trump was calling Kim Jong-un Little Rocket Man and threatening fire and fury such that the world has never known. We've then seen the pageantry behind summits, not just in Singapore, but also at the DMZ. And now we're in a kind of a weird situation where, the last 3 weeks were spent with speculation about the health of Kim Jong-un. And yet it doesn't seem that, at least before the end of this administration, or until the election, at least in November, that there's going to be any fundamental shifts. So I wonder if we can kind of wrap up with a little bit of a discussion on how you see inter-Korean relations, the fundamental challenges that North Korea is continuing to pose to not just the United States and South Korea, but the region, and where you see things playing out for the rest of this year.
Absolutely. And just before I hit that, I was remiss in mentioning that one of the new things on the peninsula in terms of alliance management is that the Australians, at least during my tenure, sent a flag officer to participate in USFK. So I would be remiss in the growing role of Australia in working with the United States in the Asia Pacific, and coming to the Korean Peninsula is important. So on to North Korea, and anytime you can have the Australians involved, it's value add in all seriousness. It's just, they're great partners, great allies, and all I can say is more. So let me turn to Kim Jong-un and North Korea. Look, I've always been of the theory that Kim Jong-un, is in charge of the country, but the model he's built is not sustainable over time. You can't be under these really heavy international sanctions. You can't be so isolated from the international community. You can't have your hard currency dry up, and you can't, at least in the early days, what he was doing to consolidate power is killing off all of your elites. I just think that to use some colloquial parlance, he has to make a move. And I just don't think the underlying conditions of his economy are sustainable over time in all of that, right? And we've seen, Gordon, you know this well, the development of informal markets in North Korea, right, as a coping mechanism for sanctions. And these markets bother the regime. They're tolerated, but they also bother the regime in that they undermine state control over time, right? You've seen more corruption. You've seen people doing things that flout some of the guidance the central government puts out. So, I think that they'll tolerate markets for a while, but over time, it comes back to my theory where the model that they built is not sustainable, and they do feel that they have to make a move. I'm not saying collapse is coming. What I'm saying is they've got to figure something out, right? And probably the easiest strategy for them in the short term is to get sanctions relief, right? Get some hard currency in, play for time, right? What government in power doesn't like to play for time? And I think that it was their strategy around these summits. And what we call inter-Korean relations with their engagement with Seoul, which is try to open up some of these avenues for hard currency, especially some of these inter-Korean projects, namely the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which is a joint North-South Korean kind of textile factories and some other concerns, for lack of a better term, where North Koreans would come in, South Korean come in, and it would generate hard currency. There's also a ski resort that was part of that. That was closed. Both of those were closed, in previous years, and they haven't been reopened. And generally, they've been layered over by multilateral sanctions, so they're harder to reopen now. So I think that was their general strategy. That strategy has not panned out, and I think they're searching for how and where and what to do next. And they would, I think their strong preference was to engage in more summit diplomacy on their terms. But the Trump administration, after these early summits, which yielded very little, I think has largely stayed away from that. You've seen some sort of correspondence back and forth, but you really haven't had a high-level engagement on a sustained basis over time that you would think might lead to anything meaningful. Meantime, every day the nuclear and missile programs continue to grow. Every day, the North Koreans are building more and more capability in those regards, and every day the situation gets more dangerous. So this isn't a situation where we should feel good and we should just relax. But I do think that more or less the prospects for some sort of negotiation between now and the U.S. election in November are very low, extremely low, very unlikely. And so I think what we're going to see is either a Biden administration pick this up in January or February, or a Trump second term pick this up in some way. But I think between now and then, largely dormant. One other point I would say that's interesting is all of this, the COVID issue in North Korea. Kim Jeong-Hoon went missing. I think some speculated as to whether this was related to COVID. But I would say, though, at a minimum, you've seen the North Koreans shut down some of these informal markets, right? So in a way, they're self-sanctioning themselves. And that is very interesting to watch, to see how long this is sustainable, because the North Koreans have a pretty resilient coping mechanism in terms of overcoming these sanctions. But the COVID-19 response has forced them to take some of these measures that have really have reduced their ability to cope with sanctions. So that's a new element. And the final thing I would say, I don't know enough to comment on the psychology of the North Korean regime under COVID-19, in that we do know that when Ebola hit in 2015, 2016 timeframe, a remote and distant threat to North Korea, the North Koreans instituted quarantines, mandatory quarantines to deal with this threat. So while the South Koreans and other nations that were, you could argue, more susceptible because of their open nature, did nothing of the sort. So there is something with these types of viruses and diseases that does seem to have resonance with the leadership. So all of that makes for an interesting couple of months, but I just don't think we're going to see a lot of movement on the negotiation fronts anytime soon.
You earlier made reference to some early missteps on the part of the Moon Jae-in administration in South Korea in responding to COVID. And among those was basically responding to Chinese pressure to be very slow to close the border with China. In fact, one of the things I thought was quite striking is that North Korea closed its border with China before South Korea did. And that, I think, goes to exactly what you're talking about, their focus on the relative threat that opposed to them. Look, I could go on for a long time. Obviously, these are issues which I care an awful lot about, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak in such detail with you on your views on developments in the peninsula. I would note that Australians have, a similar intense focus on the Korean Peninsula. There was a poll done several years ago that showed that out of all the countries in the world, the country that had the most positive opinion of South Korea and South Koreans was Australia. I think there's a recognition that South Korea is our fourth largest trading partner, the third largest destination for Australian exports, major source of investment in students and tourists coming here. And yet all of that is set on hold, at least for right now. And so one of the things we're hoping for is that as we get a bubble of relative security here in Western Australia, we'll eventually add the rest of the country, maybe New Zealand, and then the next cab off the rank will likely be a country like South Korea, where they've got a system in place where there will be a kind of inside the bubble level of trust in terms of testing and tracking that will allow us to resume direct flights. And so it may be, Mark, that it's going to be easier for you to get back to Perth by going through Seoul than by coming from Washington, D.C. So at any rate, thank you so much. This was a really enjoyable conversation. I appreciate your time and your insights. And we do indeed we look forward to enticing you back down here as soon as we can.
No, thanks, Gordon. It's a real pleasure. You're a true Asia hand in every sense of the word, and it's always an honor to come on and speak with you about anything Asia Pacific, especially if it involves baseball and fried chicken.
There we have it. All right, we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, Gordon.
Again.
Appreciate it.